On the morning of the 10th of May 1940, a German Luftwaffe bomber wing crossed into Dutch airspace before sunrise. The Dutch ground observers who spotted it tracked the formation heading west toward England, they thought, toward the North Sea. They were wrong. Over the North Sea, the entire wing turned 180 degrees and came back. The Dutch had been watching for a German attack for months. They had mobilized their army fully by April. They had a plan, a defense line, and 3 centuries of engineering built specifically to stop armies that crossed their borders. And in the first minutes of the invasion, they were already watching the wrong direction. By the time those bombers dropped their first loads on Dutch airfields, something else was already happening on the ground. On the eastern Dutch border, across a 40-kilometer front running from the River Rhine north toward the IJsselmeer, General Georg von Keutler's 18th Army was moving. Its target was a ridge of hills near a small town called Rennen, and a system of flooded fields in the valley in front of it. The Germans had studied this position for months. They knew exactly where the water was. They knew exactly where it wasn't. And they knew that one incomplete pumping station, one unfinished piece of engineering, held up by budget arguments, and a government worried about disturbing tourist traffic to a local zoo, had left a dry corridor through a vascular defense line that was supposed to be impassable. The Dutch plan was not simply to fight the Germans, it was to drown the German army's route. For nearly 350 years, the Netherlands had used water as a weapon of war, not as a metaphor or a strategy memo, but actual water pumped through actual sluices, flooding actual fields to depths, calculated precisely to make them unusable by infantry and impossible for vehicles. The system that existed in the Gelderse Valley in May 1940 was the product of more accumulated hydraulic military engineering than anywhere else on Earth. And it worked. North of the Grebbeberg, where the flooding was complete, it stopped the Germans cold. They had to cross in rubber boats. On the 13th of May, 1940, soldiers of the German 207th Infantry Division launched a river-crossing operation not against a river, but against flooded Dutch farmland. They had planned to drive through. Instead, they rode. What happened between May 10 and May 13 at the Grebbe Line is a story about what flooding can and cannot do, about the gap between a perfect plan and the clock it requires to execute, and about 2,500 Dutch conscripts, most of them farmers, factory workers, and office clerks, who had never fired a shot in combat, who held a line against 23,500 German soldiers, long enough for 6 Dutch divisions to survive and regroup behind the next barrier. It did not save the Netherlands. The Netherlands fell anyway, 5 days after Germany crossed the border, undone by paratroopers who landed behind the waterline entirely. But what happened at the Grebbe Line is a separate question, and the answer is one Germany did not expect. To understand why the Grebbe Line existed, you need to understand one fact about the Netherlands that shapes everything else about Dutch military history. Roughly a quarter of the country sits below sea level, and the rest sits barely above it. That is not a vulnerability, that is a weapon. The Dutch figured this out in 1574 during the Siege of Leiden, when they broke the Spanish army's stranglehold on the city by opening the sluices and flooding the countryside around it. The Spanish had more men, better equipment, and had been tightening the siege for months. The water ended it in days. After that, the idea was never forgotten. By 1629, Prince Frederick Henry had formalized the concept into a continuous defensive line running from the IJsselmeer south to the river wall. Sluices built into dikes gave engineers precise control over water levels across thousands of acres of low-lying polder land. The calculation was deliberate and specific. Flood to a depth of roughly 30 centimeters deep enough to turn the soil into a quagmire. No wagon or gun could cross. Shallow enough that boats were useless too. The defender could move along raised dike roads, while the attacker was simply stuck. The line held in 1672 against the French. It held against Napoleon's marshals in 1793. The only time it ever failed was in the winter of 1794–95, when temperatures dropped so far below freezing that French troops simply walked across the ice. By 1940, the system had been modernized into the Nieuwe Hollandse Waterlinie, the new Dutch water line, running 85 kilometers from Muiden, east of Amsterdam south, to the Biesbosch wetlands near Gorinchem, shielding Amsterdam, Utrecht, and Rotterdam behind a controlled flood zone. The Dutch called the territory it protected Vesting Holland Fortress Holland. The plan in the event of a German attack was always the same: fall back to this fortress, flood the approaches, and wait for French and British relief to arrive. The Grebbe Line was the forward barrier. It ran 40 kilometers north from the Rhine near Rennen to Spakenburg on the IJsselmeer, following the eastern edge of the Utrechtse Hovelrug through the Gelderse Valley. It was not primarily a fortification in the conventional sense. It was a water barrier with infantry support. A network of sluices threaded through the valley allowed Dutch engineers to flood the flat polderland in front of the main trench line to depths that made armored or motorized movement impossible. The plan was to open those sluices the moment German forces were spotted crossing the border, giving the water time to spread before any German unit reached the line. Major General J.W. Harberts commanded the E Corps, responsible for this sector. Under him sat 2 divisions holding the line. Colonel Van Loon's 4th Division held the Grebbeberg sector. The 8th Infantry Regiment, under Lieutenant Colonel Henink, occupied the hill itself and the approaches to it. In total, roughly 65,000 Dutch troops manned the Grebbe Line and its supporting positions conscripts, most of them, trained on doctrine that had not materially changed since the First World War. The Dutch army, in May 1940, was not a weak army in spirit. It was weak in hardware. It had no tanks, no anti-tank guns worth the name. Its air force flew biplanes, most of which were destroyed on airfields in the first hours of May 10. Its artillery mixed Krupp field pieces from 1903 with howitzers that could trace their lineage to before the Boer War. The defense budget had been gutted through the 1920s and only partially restored after 1936. A standing joke in the Dutch military was that there were enough bullets to train with, but not enough to fight with, though this was not entirely a joke. What the Dutch army did have was its water. Except at one place. The Grebbeberg Ridge rises roughly 50 meters above the valley floor near the town of Rennen. It is the only elevated terrain along the entire Grebbe Line, a spur of the Utrecht Hill Ridge jutting east into the flat Gelderse Valley. Because it rises above the surrounding lowland, flooding in front of it was impossible without the bomb-proof pumping station that was still under construction in May 1940. The Dutch government had estimated it would be finished in November 1940. The Germans arrived in May. The German 18th Army staff knew this. Before the war, German officers had made tourist visits to the Ouwehand Zoo on the Grebbeberg's crest, a real zoo, still operating today, with deer and exotic birds, and a lookout tower that offered a commanding view of the Dutch defensive positions on the slope below. Through binoculars purchased at the zoo gift shop, they mapped the trench lines, counted the pillboxes, and noted the absence of flooding in the corridor between the River Rhine and the base of the hill. When General von Küchler drew up the 18th Army's attack plan, the Grebbeberg was the designated penetration point, not because it was the easiest route, but because it was the only dry one. At 3:55 on the 10th of May 1940, Fall Gelb went into motion. Across the entire Western Front, Luxembourg, Belgium, the Netherlands, German forces crossed borders simultaneously. In the Netherlands, the 18th Army pushed in from the east. In the south, German paratroopers from the 7th Flieger Division dropped onto the bridges at Moerdijk, Dordrecht, and Rotterdam, which were the only land routes leading into Fortress Holland from the south. If those bridges fell, the waterline's southern flank was already bypassed before the northern battle even started. The Dutch had prepared for an attack from the east. They had not adequately prepared for an attack that would simply fly over everything they had built. Still, what happened on the Eastern Front at the Grebbe Line on May 10 was not a collapse. It was a delay, which was exactly what the Dutch needed. The I-Jasel line along the I-Jasel River was the first barrier, designed to be held for a few hours while the Grebbe Line flooding was completed. Dutch units at the I-Jasel held longer than expected in several places. At Westervoort near Arnhem, resistance was fierce enough that it was already dusk by the time the leading German elements, the SS Standarte der Führer of the SS VT Division, had fought through and massed in the city of Wageningen, directly east of the Grebbeberg. That delay mattered. The flooding in the Gelderse Valley north of the Grebbeberg was already spreading, but the flooding had not been fully established when the Germans arrived, because the German advance had been faster than Dutch doctrine anticipated. The Dutch plan assumed several hours of warning from the I-Jasel defenders before German units reached the Grebbe Line. In practice, the interval was compressed. The result was a partial defense. North of the Grebbeberg, where the flat valley floor lay, the inundation was in effect by the time German units reached it on May 11. The German 366th Infantry Regiment from the 207th Division tried advancing through this zone and ran directly into flooded fields. Their progress stopped. The regiment took artillery casualties and was thrown back in disorder, the only German attack against the Grebbe Line to be cleanly repulsed in the first 2 days. South of that, at the Grebbeberg itself, there was no water. The dry corridor was exactly what German intelligence had identified. Here the SS Standarte der Führer, roughly 6,000 men, launched the main assault on the morning of May 11. The men defending the Grebbeberg's forward outpost line were 2 companies of the 3rd Battalion of the 8th Infantry Regiment, roughly 400 soldiers at most, spread across 3 kilometers of improvised sandbag and timber positions. Most had never been in combat. Their telephone lines were cut by German artillery before dawn on May 11. They could not call for support. They could not coordinate with the regiment behind them. Each position fought more or less alone. The SS attack was precise and methodical. 2 machine gun teams would take 1 Dutch position. One team provided suppressing fire, while the other worked through orchards that concealed the movement entirely from Dutch observation. The outpost line had almost no overlapping fields of fire. Each pillbox covered its own sector and no one else's. The Germans peeled them off one by one through the day. In the northern sector of the outpost line, on the edge of the flooded zone, a section of the 19th Infantry Regiment held a position that was not properly coordinated with the 8th Regiment units to its south. Communication had broken down. When German pressure arrived, this section broke and retreated westward, opening a gap in the outpost line's northern flank. The SS exploited this immediately, turning south through the gap and encircling the remaining Dutch outposts from behind. By 18 on May 11, the entire outpost line had fallen 7 hours of fighting against a force more than 10 times its size, with no communications and no reinforcement, and it had lasted until evening. The Germans now stood at the edge of the main front line, the actual trench system on the Grebbeberg's forward slope, held by 4 full companies plus machine gun and anti-tank support. Behind them lay the Stoppline, the final defensive barrier. Behind that, the hill crest, and then open road to Fortress Holland. That night, Major General Harberts ordered a counterattack. The 2nd Battalion of the 19th Infantry Regiment would attack through the dark, retake the lost outpost positions, and restore the forward line. What followed was one of the costlier failures of the campaign. In darkness, the counterattacking battalion came under fire from other Dutch units who had not been informed it was coming. The resulting confusion stopped the attack entirely before it ever made contact with the Germans. The one positive outcome was that Dutch artillery supporting the attempt forced the Germans to cancel their own planned night assault. By dawn on May 12, both sides were back where they had ended the previous evening. The Germans at the edge of the front line, the Dutch holding it, but without the outpost buffer, without secure communications, and now with 2 full days of battle ahead of them. Here is what the Germans encountered when they looked north from the Grebbeberg sector on May 12. The polderland of the Gelderse Valley north of the Grebbeberg sat slightly below the level of the surrounding dike system. When the sluices opened, water crept across it slowly and spread wide. From a distance, it looked like a fog across the fields. Up close, it was 25 to 30 centimeters of standing water over soft Dutch clay, too shallow for any boat, too deep and too soft for any vehicle. A man could wade through it, but a truck could not cross it at all. This is what 350 years of Dutch hydraulic military engineering had produced: not a wall, but a trap. A landscape that looked traversable and was not. The German 207th Infantry Division's 366th Regiment, which had already been bloodied trying to advance through this zone on May 11, now confirmed what their reconnaissance had told them. The inundated Gelders Valley north of the Grebbeberg was not going to be crossed on foot or by vehicle. If the Germans were going to outflank the Grebbeberg from the north, they needed boats. They did not have boats positioned for this. The 207th was a reserve division. It had seen no combat before May 10, and its equipment and logistics reflected a formation that had been expected to follow up after the real fighting was done, not to wade through Dutch polders. Getting rubber boats forward, organizing a water crossing operation against flooded farmland, training infantry who had never done anything like it. All of this took time. That time was exactly what the flooding was designed to buy. While the Germans reorganized north of the Grebbeberg, the fighting on the hill itself continued through May 12 with a ferocity that German commanders had not expected from Dutch conscripts against SS troops. General Karl von Tiedemann, commanding the 207th Division, had been told to take the Grebbeberg in a day. He was now on his 2nd day with the front line still holding. On May 12, the SS Standart der Führer launched its main assault against the front line on the Grebbeberg's eastern slope. The Dutch positions here were a combination of concrete casemates at key points, machine guns in prepared positions, and infantry in trenches that had been dug with the particular stubbornness of men who understood they were defending their own country's last usable farmland. The SS assault made progress, but paid for every meter. Dutch artillery from 6 batteries on and behind the hill struck the attacking formations repeatedly. Individual machine gun positions held until they were physically destroyed. By the end of May 12, the SS had breached the front line at several points, but had not cleared it. A reserve division and an elite SS regiment, together roughly 23,500 men with artillery support and Luftwaffe available, had spent 2 full days taking a position held by 2,500 Dutch conscripts and had not finished the job. Von Tiedemann made the decision to relieve the SS and commit his own 207th Infantry Division's regular regiments to a fresh assault on May 13. The 322nd Regiment would carry the main attack. He would also call in Junkers Ju 87 Stuka dive bombers to provide direct air support against the Dutch positions on the crest. Before dawn on May 13, Major Willem Peter Lanzat, commanding the 1st Battalion of the 8th Infantry Regiment, held his command post in the Tea House Pavilion near the entrance of Uwehan's Zoo at the hill's crest, the same zoo whose lookout tower German officers had used the previous year to survey these positions. By May 13, Lanzat's battalion had been fighting for 48 hours with fragmentary communications, limited ammunition resupply, and the knowledge that the men forward of them on the slope were engaged in close-quarters combat that had devolved into grenades, pistols, and bayonets. What made May 13 at the Grebbeberg different from May 11 and 12 was the scale and coordination of the German assault. The 322nd Regiment attacked along the entire front simultaneously. 27 Stuka dive bombers struck Dutch positions on the crest. The stop line, the last defensive line behind the front line, began to crumble at multiple points. Individual Dutch companies held their positions and were simply surrounded and destroyed one by one. The line's coherence was gone. What remained was a collection of isolated resistance pockets that the Germans methodically eliminated through the afternoon. At 20:30 on May 13, the order came from Ecken Corps headquarters: abandon the Grebbe Line and withdraw to the east front of Fortress Holland. What followed was one of the most skillfully executed retreats of the entire 1,940 campaign. The Dutch did not break and run. Behind a screen of rearguard units that fought deliberately to slow any German pursuit, and under cover of thick ground mist that rose that night over the Rhine and the Lech valleys, the bulk of 6 Dutch divisions disengaged from the Grebbe Line and marched west. They crossed the lower Rhine and the Lech using ferries and bridges that had been held in reserve specifically for this moment. German pursuit was cautious. Von Küchler's forces had taken heavier casualties than anticipated and were not eager to push hard into darkness against an enemy whose rearguards were still shooting. By morning of May 14, the Dutch Field Army was behind the inundations of the Nieuwe Hollandse Waterlinie inside Fortress Holland. The Germans reached the abandoned Grebbe Line positions and found them empty. Multiple German accounts recorded the same fact. They had anticipated heavy fighting when they approached the Dutch positions on the morning of May 14, and what they found was silence. North of the Grebbeberg, on the same morning, the situation told a specific story about what the flooding had accomplished. The German 207th Division's elements attempting to cross the inundated Gelders Valley had secured rubber boats by May 13 and conducted a crossing operation. Photographs taken by Lieutenant C. J. Stipp of the Dutch Army, now in the collection of Het Utrecht's Archive in Utrecht, showed German soldiers in rubber boats crossing flooded Dutch farmland. The military term for this operation is an obstacle crossing. The doctrinal assumption for armies attacking the Netherlands had been that the main obstacle crossings would be rivers. Instead, the Germans were crossing a farmer's field that had been turned into a shallow lake. The crossing took time to organize. It was delayed by the need to bring boats forward. The German units that crossed the flooded zone north of the Grebbeberg did not do so until May 13, 3 days after the invasion began, against a position the Germans had planned to overrun in one. The numbers from the Battle of the Grebbeberg are specific, and they tell a story that German planners had not written. The German forces attacking the Grebbeberg, the 207th Infantry Division at 17,500 men, plus the SS Standarte der Führer at approximately 6,000, supported by 5 artillery battalions and Luftwaffe dive bombing, for a total attacking strength in the sector of roughly 23,500. The Dutch defenders at the Grebbeberg, the 8th Infantry Regiment, 2,500 men, with supporting artillery batteries on the hill, approximately a 10-to-1 ratio in favor of the attackers. The Germans planned to take the position in 1 day. It actually took 3. Dutch killed in the battle 4, 2, 5, 1, 8 officers and 407 enlisted soldiers. German killed. The official German figure is 238, but this has been contested by Dutch historians since the battle. Multiple eyewitness accounts describe German casualties significantly higher, and the figures the 207th Division reported upward were subject to the same institutional pressure toward understatement that characterized German casualty reporting throughout the war. The range given in Dutch military history is between 250 and 300 killed, with wounded at roughly 4 times that figure. The SS Standarte der Führer suffered disproportionately. This was its first combat. The regiment had been built as an elite formation around ideological selection, criteria, and political commitment. What it met at the Grebbeberg was experienced in neither Dutch conscripts, who had been placed in positions, told to hold them, and had done so past all expectation. The SS regiment's losses in its first 48 hours of combat were severe enough that German commanders reassigned it on the 3rd day, pulling it south to support the 9th Panzer Division's operations in the southern Netherlands, and the 207th Division's regular infantry regiments finished what the SS had started. The flooding north of the Grebbeberg had forced the German 366th Regiment to stop, reorganize, acquire boats, plan a crossing operation, and executed a sequence that consumed the better part of 3 days. The flooded Gelders Valley had functioned exactly as the Dutch waterline system had been designed to function. It had not stopped the Germans permanently. It had bought time. What that time purchased is the strategic fact at the center of this story. The Dutch plan for the Grebbe Line was never to hold it indefinitely. It was to hold it long enough for 6 divisions to have a corridor through which to withdraw into Fortress Holland. In military planning terms, this is called a delaying action. You trade ground for time, and the time is used to set up the next position. The withdrawal to the east front of Fortress Holland was planned. The rearguard fighting that covered it was planned. The bridges and ferries over the Rhine and the Lech that the retreating troops used were kept in reserve, specifically for this moment. The Grebbe Line held for 3 days, and the planned duration, per Dutch military doctrine, was long enough to allow the retreat. It achieved this. The German 18th Army had been assigned to the Netherlands campaign as the weakest force deployed in Fall Gelb, deliberately so. The main effort was through the Ardennes toward Sedan. The Netherlands was, in German planning terms, a sideshow to a feint. The 18th Army contained 4 regular and 3 reserve infantry divisions. It had 1 armored division, the 9th Panzer, with 141 tanks total, deployed south against the Peel-Ram line. No panzers were assigned to the Grebbe Line sector at all, precisely because the Dutch water defense was expected to make armor useless there. the German plan assumed Dutch resistance would collapse within 3 to 5 days. The Grebbe Line alone took 3 of those days. When von Küchler's forces finally broke through at the Grebbeberg on May 13 and pushed to pursue the Dutch retreat, they found themselves in an odd position. They had won the battle, they came to fight, and the war was ending anyway, from a direction they had not attacked. The Rotterdam bombing on May 14, Luftwaffe Heinkel, he 111 bombers dropping on the city center after a surrender ultimatum had been delivered. But before the confirmation of its acceptance reached, the pilots killed somewhere between 600 and 900 civilians and leveled the entire city center. The Dutch government capitulated the following day, on May 15, in all provinces except Zeeland. Fortress Holland had never been attacked. The waterline, the Dutch had spent the equivalent of 50 billion euros in modern money constructing over 125 years, had not been tested. The 6 divisions that retreated from the Grebbe Line were behind it, intact and positioned to fight. They never got the chance. The surrender came because German paratroopers had seized the southern bridges on the first day, and airborne assault bypassed everything the Dutch had prepared in a way that 350 years of waterline thinking had not anticipated. The Grebbe Line had done its job. The problem was that its job had become irrelevant before it was finished. But here is the detail that German commanders noted in their own records without particular celebration. The Dutch army that retreated from the Grebbe Line on the night of May 13 to 14 was not destroyed. It was intact. It had fought a superior force for 3 days, traded ground for time at a cost of 425 killed, and withdrawn in good order behind the next barrier. The German command, expecting to find the Dutch, demoralized and disorganized, found the Grebbe Line trenches empty and the road to Utrecht temporarily open, but no broken army to pursue. The Grebbeberg Military Cemetery sits on the hill today, above the town of Rennen, inside what was once the Dutch defensive position. It holds approximately 800 Dutch soldiers killed in May 1940. The German soldiers buried there initially were reinterred after the war at the German Military Cemetery in Jesselstein, where more than 30,000 German war dead are buried, the largest German military cemetery in the world. The Ouwehands Zoo is still there too. It still operates. The lookout tower from which German officers surveyed the Dutch positions before the war still stands above the same hill where the 8th Infantry Regiment dug in the spring of 1940. The flooding system the Dutch built and maintained for 350 years was decommissioned in 1951. The Grebbe Line was formally disbanded by the Dutch government that same year. The new Hollandse Waterlinie, the new Dutch waterline that had protected Fortress Holland and was never attacked in May 1940, was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2021. Recognized not as a relic of failed strategy, but as an extraordinary engineering achievement sustained across centuries. Germany's weakest army in Fall Gelb was assigned to conquer the Netherlands in 3 to 5 days. Its most modern element, the elite SS Standarte der Führer, combat experienced and ideologically motivated, ran into Dutch conscripts holding a hillside without tanks, without anti-tank guns of consequence, without air support, and with communications knocked out on the first morning. The SS regiment took casualties so heavy in its first 48 hours that it was pulled from the line before the battle was finished. The flooding that worked the inundated Gelderse Valley north of the Grebbeberg stopped German motorized movement entirely and forced a boat crossing operation that consumed 3 of the 5 days the Netherlands had before. Its surrender. The flooding that did not work The incomplete pumping station at the Grebbe itself handed the Germans their route through, and the difference between those two outcomes was one unfinished construction project, delayed by a government that did not want to disturb zoo visitors. The Dutch water defense system was not defeated. It was bypassed. No German soldier ever crossed the Nieuwe Hollandse waterline under fire. The flooding of the Gelders Valley performed exactly as designed. The Grebbe Line held as long as it needed to. What the Dutch had not prepared for was not a crossing, it was a flight. And on the morning of May 14, when German troops crept forward expecting to face Dutch rearguards at every corner and found the Grebbe Line positions abandoned and silent, a German unit that had spent 3 days learning that Dutch conscripts were considerably harder to kill than anticipated wrote its own lesson in its after-action accounts. These men had not broken. They had simply gone. The Grebbeberg Cemetery was established immediately after the fighting, on the hill itself, by German military authorities. German and Dutch dead were buried side by side in the first days. That detail has stayed with the town of Rennen ever since. Each year, on May 4, the Dutch National Remembrance Day candles are lit at the graves, 425 Dutch soldiers. The hill they held for 3 days against 10 times their number. The water in the valley below that bought them the time to hold it. The pump station they never finished.